Hello and welcome to my review of the Darksword Armory 15th century hand-and-a-half sword. This sword is on loan for purposes of the review. So what is a hand-and-a-half sword? If you're like me, you find a lot of the terminology and words used to classify medieval swords quite confusing. I use the oakshot typology to understand the historical context and classification of swords. The oakshot typology is based upon the period of use of the sword, the nature of the blade, the guard, and the pommel. And then there's letters and numbers that oakshot has assigned to them. Roman numerals for the blade, traditional numbers for the guard, and letters for the pommel. And it does a very good job of classifying those swords. However, it's quite academic and not really used in everyday conversation. More basic language is my problem. The modern English language terminology used to classify swords is very imprecise. It's same terms used to define different things defined by the same terms, and I find it a lot of the terms like broadsword, longsword, short sword, bastard sword, great sword, hand-and-a-half sword, side sword, arming sword, knightly sword, two-handed sword are all terms that are used frequently to describe very similar weapons that may have been used for various different things or vice versa. At the same time, a lot of these terminologies and words are used to define swords by just shape and size, but not really taking into consideration their period of use, the intended use, or the fighting style. Medieval swords existed over a long period of time, centuries in fact, and were going through many changes. And there were many swords that were developed for very specialized use during this time as well. So I've tried to simplify it down just for my own use, and I think a very good generic definition of a medieval sword is maybe something like this. It was a long, wide, straight, double-edged blade with a cruciform guard. It may have been designed for use with one hand, or two hands, or perhaps even both. It was mainly used for cutting, but it could have been used for thrusting as well. It could have been used on horseback, or it could have been used on foot. After that, I think museum curators, historians, sword enthusiasts, and even the gaming culture have taken over and put many different categories and uses on medieval swords. For my purposes, I like to define them in three very general categories. And the first is just a sword or a medieval sword, and it's something like this. And terms like one-handed, single-handed, arming, knightly, side, or short would fall into this classification. And this is a sword with a shorter blade, like this one has, a grip made to be used with one hand, and a sword could have been used alone, it could have been used with a shield. And I think that's pretty much the idea we get when we think about a medieval sword. The second classification is this, a longsword. And I think this is a great example of a longsword. And terms like two-handed, war, bastard, or hand-and-a-half sword could also fall into this category. And this is a sword with a long grip, which could be used with two hands, a sword with a longer blade, and it could have been used on foot, or it could have been used in a mounted fashion. And the third classification for me is a great sword, but that's something that we would call a two-hander, a doppelhander, a biddenhander. And these were swords that were used both in the medieval period and into the Renaissance period. These are very tall swords, as tall as a person, that were used primarily by infantry. And I use these three general categories to make sense of where a sword fits, and then I use oakshot to really get a good understanding of the historical context. So, A hand and a half sword is a type of longsword. It's got that two-handed grip. It's got a bit of a longer blade. And in this case, this is a bit of a very versatile and unique sword in that it could have been used effectively with one or two hands. It was balanced for that. It could have been used on foot, could have been used with a shield, or it could have been used on horseback. So let's now talk about the Darksword Armory 15th century hand and a half sword, which I think is a great example of a hand and a half or a bastard sword. Overall, the sword is 44.5 inches long, so it has very good reach. It has a blade, which is 33.75 inches long, made from 5160 high carbon steel, which has been dual tempered, with a softer core and hardened edges, which make it very effective for durability. The fuller runs about 75% the length of the blade. The blade itself is 2 inches thick at its thickest and tapers to this very fine point at the end. It's a good example of an oakshot type 18A blade. The sword itself weighs 2 3/4 pounds and has a point of balance about 4 inches down from the guard. Again, which make it effective for use one-handed or two-handed. I think this is a very practical warrior's sword and has a very versatile design. The blade, with its wide portion, makes it very good for cutting, and the fine tapered point makes it very good for thrusting. So this is a sword that can be used for quick cuts, for slashing, for very heavy chopping blows, or to seek out those gaps in armor and effectively pierce through them. The sword performed quite well in its cutting test, doing all those things, cutting, slashing, and thrusting through bottles. Very effective. I think that makes this sword a great choice for someone who is looking for a variety of different uses and to use the sword in a lot of different ways. One-handed, two-handed, cutting, and or thrusting. And of course, that's one of the things that is very unique about a hand and a half or a bastard sword is its extreme versatility. You know, the 15th century was a point where plate armor reached its peak in effectiveness. It covered, or could cover, those who could afford it from head to toe. And to deal with this, you needed a weapon that had the ability to find those gaps in the armor and effectively pierce through them and maybe any other protection which was underneath, leather perhaps, or mail. But at the same time, not everyone, and probably definitely not the majority, could afford that type of armor. You would still find wide use of jack plate and leather brigadines. So a sword, which could be an effective cutter, was still in high demand and needed. And in fact, to quote Oakshott, he found this sword to be very effective. And in fact, the type 18 and its subtypes were used most widely, the most widely used swords between 1410 and 1510 all over Europe. So a sword which had a great deal of use for a long period of time. The grip is 7 3/4 inches long. To the end of the pommel is 10 1/4 inches. The tang of the blade is peened over the pommel at the end. This is a very good example of an Oakshott type T scent stopper pommel. It has 8 sides and it's been polished to quite a high shine, and it has a good deal of heft to it to provide the balance needed for the sword. The guard is 7.5 inches long, and it is an Oakshott style 6 guard. The construction of this guard and pommel is quite nice. The guard is flattened on top and bottom and then flares out to these nice quillions at the end. By the way, this could make for a nice effective weapon for punching into the face of your opponent too at close range. And the pommel could also be used as an effective weapon, either with your hand to just butt into the face or turn that sword around and used as an effective bludgeon and really give him a good blow to the head. There's quite a bit of heft and weight to this. The grip itself is wood wrapped in a high quality leather and stitched. Overall, very simplistic but very nice design for that guard and pommel at the end. Included with the sword are two choices of scabbard. The basic scabbard that comes with it is a wood core wrapped in a very high quality leather, and there's an upgrade where you can move up to interlaced sword belt, which comes with the scabbard. The sword comes also with instructions on how to use that belt. The belt doesn't have a buckle, so there's a bit of a technique to using it properly to wear it snugly when you wear it. And in addition to that, it comes with instructions on how to care for the sword and the proper use of the sword. Of course, it's your sword, and once you get it, if you want to use it for whatever purpose, that's up to you. But they obviously recommend certain uses for it. In my testings for cutting, I do stick to their instructions, and it's mainly bottles and fruit. No destructive testing of any kind from my perspective. I think this is a very attractive and practical sword. It's extremely versatile and can be used in a lot of different ways. If you're looking for a cutter, if you're looking for a thruster, if you're looking for a one-hand, if you're looking for a two-handed, this sword can meet all those requirements for you. So very versatile. And by the way, that's what you'd expect from a hand-and-a-half sword. At the same time, I think this makes for a very nice display piece. It's a good example of an Oakshot Type 18A blade with a Style 6 guard and a Type T pommel, and would be a nice addition to a collection for those display purposes as well. Hope you've enjoyed this review. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time.